Hey folks, it's Jeremy, the host of Blammo. Thanks so much for listening. This is a preview of one of our exclusive shows on Patreon. These are member-supported shows, meaning they only happen because of our incredible members and community. So check out a preview of the episode, and if you like it, consider joining us on Patreon at patreon.com/Blammo, where we have tons of exclusive Blammo episodes, shows, our amazing Slack group, and we're adding new things for members all the time. If not, no worries, we still love you, and we literally have hundreds of episodes of Blammo all free for you to dive into. Thanks so much.
Hey everyone, welcome to another episode of the Thai Workwear podcast. My name is Derek Guy, and my co-host is Peter Zotolo. So a couple of months ago, I came across a blurb, I think it was on Instagram for one of these outdoor archive accounts that I follow. And it was a blurb for a book called Shopping All the Way to the Woods by Rachel Gross, who teaches, I think, U.S. history and environmental history over at the University of Colorado in Denver. The book is about how we buy outdoor gear to prepare ourselves for this kind of spiritual connection with the outdoors. And this is the creation of an authentic outdoor identity is essentially done through shopping. It's this paradox of kind of capitalist consumerism and untouched wilderness and the idea of an authentic self. As soon as I read about it, I thought this would be Professor Gross would be such a great guest on our podcast, because Peter and I often talk about how clothes are a type of social language, and we buy clothes to both explore and express an identity. When I actually got a press copy of the book and read through it, I knew it was going to be good, but it turned out to be one of the best books I've read in recent years on this topic. It's incredibly accessible and easy to read. And although it's not necessarily about menswear, you can basically transpose so much of what she writes about to anything that you've read about menswear, from kind of like early 2000s Americana to the exploration of the use of streetwear and how companies are now marketing goods through various identities. So I was really excited to have her on, and we talked about the book. Peter was unfortunately not able to join for this episode, so this will just be Professor Gross and I. Let's dive in. Hey everyone, welcome to another episode of the Thai Workwear podcast. My name is Derek Guy, and I'm your host for today, as Peter is taking the episode off. However, I am joined by a very special guest, Professor Rachel Gross, who's a history professor at the University of Colorado, Denver. She recently wrote a book called Shopping All the Way to the Woods: How the Outdoor Industry Sold Nature to America. It's easily one of the best books I've read in a while, and I'm really excited to have her on. Welcome to the podcast, Professor.
Thank you so much for having me.
Before we get into the book, tell me a little bit about your background. What do you teach at the university?
Sure. As a history professor, I teach classes on business history, women and gender history, and public history. And that means I sometimes get to integrate some of my interests on the outdoor industry and how people buy goods to acquire kind of a sense of identity, as well as get the stuff into the classes that I teach.
So yeah, one of the reasons why I wanted to have you on this podcast is because your book touches on so many of the themes that Peter and I talk about on the pod, which is this kind of intersection between culture, identity, and fashion, and how people buy things to either create an identity or express an identity. And your book is about the irony of the American outdoor experience, of how people essentially buy things, not just for a functional purpose, but also to be the right kind of person to be in the outdoors. How did you land on this project?
It really has its origin in my personal passion for outdoor recreation. When I was a kid, I thought, I read all these kind of outdoor adventure books about boys' experience and life in the woods as independent kids. And I thought, this is the kind of person I want to be. So in many ways, this book is the realization of that childhood dream of spending a lot of time outdoors, except, of course, I spend my time in the archives and libraries more than I do on mountaintops, but it's really an exploration of those themes. The other part of the origin of this project has to do with the fields that I studied. Environmental history and business history often deal with questions around kind of where the meanings of what wilderness and nature is. And I thought, gosh, it seems like one of the big ways that Americans engage with the wild nature out there is actually through acquiring stuff, right? Through shopping. And so I kind of brought together that personal interest with my reading of the fields of history and said, kind of, why do Americans spend so much time acquiring goods if they're talking all about escaping to an anti-commercial kind of nature out there? And that's how I came to this project.
What was the research process like? What did you use for your archival research?
Well, there's no one, or at least when I started this project 13 years ago, there was no one place that you go and find, here are all the records of outdoor companies for the last 150 years. That would be a lot of fun, but it didn't exist. So I traveled to libraries and archives all over the country. They're often located in places that you might expect have a history when it comes to wilderness recreation. So think kind of gateway towns to mountainous areas or cities adjacent to national parks. And when I went to those archives and libraries, I looked at company records, military records, actual material objects, if there were collections of that nature. And I assembled kind of this long list of materials and then started analyzing what do the stories that get told here teach us about something bigger than just one company history.
Tell me about how going into the outdoors even became a thing, because I assume people have been going into the outdoors for, millennia, but when did it become a kind of activity, as a leisurely activity, as kind of something that you do to relax?
That's right. Yeah, you're talking about kind of that transition from being outside out of necessity because people lived and worked outdoors, to the shift to seeing it as a leisure activity that you would do for fun, perhaps on the weekends or for a month in the summer. That happened in the post-Civil War period in the 19th century in the United States. This was when more Americans than ever were living in industrialized cities. And so they felt pretty far removed from what they imagined as kind of the connection to nature and the land and outdoor work that their ancestors had. And so they sought out, with their newly found free time, adventures and recreation and solitude in the woods along a river or a lake as a way of kind of reconnecting with what they thought kind of their American heritage was all about. And that access and that interest in leisure time activities outdoors only grew from the end of the 19th century through the early 20th century, when the experiences became more accessible and cheaper to more people.
I remember reading the accounts of industrializing England and all the soot in the air. And I imagine some of the pollution inside the cities must have influenced people's idea of like, we should get out of this dirty place and go into the woods and connect to nature. Do you think that played a role at all, or?
Oh, hugely. Yeah, I think even some of the early advertisements I see from outdoor gear companies, they kind of have a picture in the corner of kind of a man chained to a desk, kind of breathing in that dirty industrial air and kind of thinking through what it would be like to be fishing on a pond right now. And so that distinction isn't just kind of a theoretical question that people were weighing. It was kind of images and feelings that they encountered very directly through advertising materials from outdoor companies.
Your book starts with a story about buckskin garments and how the buckskin garment evolved. What exactly is a buckskin garment?
Sure. Buckskin is a deer skin, right? It's a tan deer hide. Readers might kind of recognize it from the iconic imagery of Teddy Roosevelt and his fringed buckskin or leather jacket. The important part of the buckskin story isn't just that people wore this kind of iconic Western wear in the late 19th century in the American woods, but the question is really, how did they acquire it? Most of the guidebooks of that era said, hey, if you want to be a real outdoorsman, you got to craft this stuff yourself. So kill the deer, tan the hide, and make your own buckskin suit. But many of the guidebook authors themselves, many of the outdoorsmen who are reading these guides, didn't actually have the skill, the time, or the inclination to do that. And so they were often acquiring these buckskin suits from Native American women who were the real experts in crafting these goods. And that's pretty important because it shows that even 150 years ago, there was a disconnect between kind of the ethos of here's the right way to get back to nature, here's the right way to acquire these goods, and then what people's actual practices were.
Was the idea that you should shoot the deer and tan the hide, was it to say that you're going to be a self-sufficient man out in the woods who doesn't need to essentially engage in any trade? Is that the idea?
Yeah, self-sufficiency is a big part of the kind of ethos of the outdoors. The woodcraft era, that is how historians often define this time in outdoor recreation, is defined by the notion that you need to use nature as a storehouse. So anything that you need to survive ought to be crafted by your own hands from nature, from the fire you use to cook on, from the bed that you sleep on, to your buckskin suit. But I also think that there's something interesting going on here that has to do with the anti-commercialism in the outdoor industry that has grown up alongside the practice itself, which is to say, a lot of guidebooks said you have to make your own buckskin suit, not just because of self-sufficiency, but because we can't trust those shopkeepers, right? You don't want to acquire goods that people are going to tell you you need that you don't really need to bring with you. That's going to mark you as a beginner, as a greenhorn, as they might say in the language of the day. And I think that's important because I actually trace this anti-commercial attitude, the suspicion of acquiring too many goods for fear of being seen as a kind of a lover of fashion, not rather than functional necessity, from that period all the way to the 21st century. And so there's really similar language in the buckskin era, in the military surplus era of the 50s, and to the synthetic fibers that are so popular in the 21st century, where people along the way are saying, watch out for people who are going to recommend goods that you don't actually really need. You should be a better kind of consumer who's more aware and who's able to make the right choices for yourself.
Was the reason, I assume the reason they would buy the buckskin garments from Native American women is because they didn't have the skills. They couldn't make a garment as good, and they didn't want to learn how. Is that essentially the reason?
Yeah, I mean, time and skill are a big part of the answer to that question. And I also think that there was this concern consistent with what we might experience in the 21st century of kind of learning the language of clothing, and getting an authentic garment would mean that you're learning the right look, right? It's not just that you need a buckskin suit, but you want one that looks exactly correct according to the guidebook and according to your fellow participants. And so a lot of the early kind of outdoors people recount that they would buy their buckskin suits and then kind of sit on the train hoping that people would think that they didn't just buy them new, right? That they already had used them many times and they were actually quite experienced. And so there wasn't just a concern of getting the right garment, but that the garment had a used kind of worn look to it, that it suggested expertise rather than someone who just went shopping. And so that's part of why turning to kind of expert makers was a good idea for these early consumers.
One of the things I found really funny about your chapter on this is that some of the themes sound exactly like how we, at least in menswear, how many people talk about, buying the right boots and how they should look to signal that you're a kind of more authentic laborer, if you will.
Mm-hmm,
but the buckskin garment that you're writing about is like late 19th century, and they're thinking of the garment as hearkening back to a more authentic past, a more authentic manual labor of the past. And even though this is like 1880 or so, what do you think it is about looking back at the past as a more authentic, better version of society today that is so consistent throughout history?
Yeah, I think it's a really misplaced nostalgia, but such a compelling one. It's certainly a narrative that I was attached to when I started this project. I thought, kind of, gosh, the outdoors is so commercialized now, but I'm going to write about that time period before that was true, before people were obsessed with acquiring stuff as a way of kind of shortcutting their path to authenticity. And I was surprised to find that actually my desire for that narrative reflected the fact that I too had bought into a kind of nostalgia for an American past that I don't think existed. And so when we're talking about kind of the 1880s, an outdoor consumer is wearing buckskin suits just so because they want to harken back to kind of what they saw as the heyday of the white male pioneer on the plains, kind of making his way, conquering and civilizing the land, and erasing Native American presence in the process. We can see the same kind of story repeating itself in the decades that follow. That was surprising to me. And I think it shows kind of the power that clothes have to kind of tell those stories in shorthand, and how persistent they are throughout the decades, even as we kind of have very informed histories that might suggest other kinds of narratives.
It's interesting to me in that chapter where you discuss who's essentially allowed to wear the buckskin garment, or at least how the meaning of the garment changes depending on who's wearing it. If it's a white male outdoorsman, it signals a kind of virile masculinity, skills, authenticity. But when it's on a Native American, at the time, Native American students were forced to essentially abandon their own types of dress and put on more white settler clothes. Were women at the time also allowed to wear white buckskin garments, or was this essentially only something that white men would be wearing?
There were some women outdoor recreationists who also would have been able to wear buckskin suits, although more often I imagine it was buckskin fringe jackets paired with skirts, right? Often with bloomers underneath. So they were wearing a few more layers in that case. But I think the broader point that you're hinting at is a really fascinating one, which is that even in a specific decade, clothes don't have an inherent singular meaning that attaches to them kind of regardless of context. Rather, kind of what you're pointing out is that the language of buckskin differed depending on the wearer, right? And so where it might have signaled virile masculinity for some, it was a sign of backwardness and a resistance to white civilization on the other hand. And the reason I included those important anecdotes about kind of students at Native American boarding schools forced to don kind of the clothes of white and Western civilization is that they show that it's not buckskin that ultimately has the power in the story, but the kind of the broader community context that's imbuing these items with particular meanings in particular settings.
That's another interesting theme that I found in your book, is that the creation of these meanings is not just from the top down. It's not just that the people that are making the items are, kind of marketing this imagery, but also kind of swells from the bottom up. And it's kind of this co-creation of top and bottom, creating the meaning of how we understand garments. Would that be correct?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. And what you're pointing to kind of gets at the heart of the challenge, I think, that both historians and contemporary commentators have in accessing kind of how to tell stories from the bottom up. Because you could imagine that it's easier to find this corporate narrative of how kind of companies shape meaning by looking at company histories, right? You look at their advertising or internal corporate records and say like, here's how they shape the messages around what this jacket or this pair of boots might mean. It's a whole lot harder, both in the historical sense and I think in the contemporary moment, to understand what are the meanings that consumers attach to this? Like kind of why do individuals desire these objects and kind of what does it mean to them when they don them? I was able to trace those in, a few different ways by looking at photographs, journal entries from people's travels, sometimes through the letters that they sent to corporations, like explaining here's why I bought this and how I talked about it to my friends. But it's a harder story to access, but such an important one because it shows that kind of though outdoor companies were really intent on selling particular kinds of narratives to a narrow, at first, market, they weren't really in control, and that consumers themselves could attach their own stories and meanings to the products that they bought. And new markets were discovering these beautiful and often very functional objects all the time and using them for their own purposes.
Did you find any writers during that period that wrestled with this contradiction between the idea that you should be kind of self-sufficient out in the woods, get everything and build everything with your own hands, but then also recommending people to buy certain things? Were there people that recognized that tension and that contradiction?
Absolutely. Guidebook authors by the turn of the 20th century kind of would reveal that dilemma directly to their readers. One wrote about, saying like, you really should make all of this yourself, but I can't in good conscience tell you that Abercrombie and Fitch is really the place that you could buy this tent if you need to. And like, I really should tell you to make your own stuff, but here's my favorite brand of soup tablet if you're going to buy one of them. So kind of, I could sense the reluctance of these guidebook authors, but they started to share particular brand and product recommendations to readers in a way that they wouldn't have done a couple of decades earlier. And I can see how the outdoor industry, outdoor retailers and manufacturers would pick up on these recommendations and kind of build a conversation where kind of they would reference particular guidebook authors and say, hey, if you want to understand the outdoors, you better get Camping and Woodcraft by Horace Kephart. And then Kephart's books, which he sold to many, many readers, would say, okay, you need to go to Abercrombie and Fitch or get their catalog and buy these particular products. So they were talking to each other in a way that was new in the early 20th century.
They're almost like early influencers, like brand collaborations.
Right. And I don't think this is a question of kind of a conspiracy to convince people, like buy this one tent, right? These guidebook authors were really kind of concerned that their recommendations would sway people in ways that they didn't want. And so they often cautioned kind of the anti-commercial values that I previously mentioned right alongside these recommendations. And so it was less of a kind of a naked hustling for customers and more like a cautious warning, like, oh, I don't really want to tell you, but okay, here's what you should know about these companies and what to buy.
That the name that you brought up is a great segue into getting a little bit into menswear history. Anyone who's been into menswear for a while will know that Abercrombie and Fitch is not just the kind of, well, now it's like a trendy, almost like more respectable, quote unquote, fast fashion brand. I mean, they do all these trendy styles, but people don't recognize them as fast fashion. But they used to be a real outdoorsman kind of brand. What was that history like in the early 20th century?
Sure, yeah. Abercrombie and Fitch billed itself as the kind of stopping point on the way to the woods for elite outdoorsmen and women, mostly on the East Coast of the early 20th century. They had a 12-story headquarters in Manhattan. And so if you wanted to kind of equip yourself for an outdoor adventure, you might stop kind of at this green respite in the city and acquire all of the goods and clothing that you needed. The reason I thought that Abercrombie and Fitch was an important story to include is that I can see in kind of the shape of...
Want to hear the rest? Listen to the full episode and many more other exclusive episodes over on our Patreon. Visit patreon.com/Blamo to sign up and join the Blam family. You also get access to our exclusive members-only Slack group where we chat about this and a ton of other things. So head over to patreon.com/Blamo and we'll see you there.